How does the most powerful army on Earth lose more than 1,000 men, taking one small hill from a handful of farmers? And why would the general who technically won that day spend the rest of the war too haunted to ever fight that way again? I have spent most of my life studying this single afternoon. I have walked that ground myself. I have read the letters the survivors mailed home to their wives. And I am telling you, what really happened on that hill is far stranger, far bloodier, and far more human than the tidy version you were handed in a classroom. So picture the morning of June 17th, 1775. A British general stands on the deck of a warship in Boston Harbor, staring across the water at something that simply should not be there. Overnight, in near total darkness and near total silence, a colonial militia has raised an entire fort on the high ground directly across from him. Earthen walls, wooden barriers, a fortified line, all of it thrown up in a single night. Less than a mile from the largest concentration of military power on the continent, and not one of his sentries heard a sound. By every calculation that mattered, this should have been routine. Sail across the harbor, march up the slope, scatter the rebels, and be back in the city before supper. The men waiting on that hill were not soldiers. They were blacksmiths and shopkeepers and farm boys gripping the same hunting rifles they used to feed their families. The men forming up at the bottom were professionals who had fought campaigns across Europe. But here is what no one standing on that deck understood yet, and it is the thing I want you to hold on to for the next few minutes. By sunset, that quiet green hillside would be soaked red. More than 1,000 of the finest soldiers in the world would lie dead or shattered across that slope. An entire town that had stood for almost 150 years would be burning to the ground, and the army that walked away calling itself the winner would never truly recover. Let me show you exactly how it happened. But before we climb that hill together, let me welcome you properly. Thank you for being here, and thank you for spending part of your day with this channel. If you love the kind of history that goes deeper than the dates and the names, the history that lets you feel what these people felt, then do me a favor and subscribe right now, because stories like this one are exactly what we do here, and I would hate for you to miss the next one. Now let me set the stage, because to understand that hill, you first have to understand the strange situation around it. In the spring of 1775, Boston was a city under siege, but not in the way you might imagine. The British Army occupied the city itself. Thousands of red-coated soldiers patrolled the streets. Warships ruled the harbor, and the military governor ran the colony from his headquarters like a man holding a tightening fist. Soldiers drilled on the common in neat formations while the residents watched from behind closed shutters. There were checkpoints at every major intersection, armed patrols along the waterfront, and artillery positioned to cover every approach by sea. On paper, the British owned that city completely, and yet here is the twist that almost nobody expects. The colonists had the British surrounded. After the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord that April, thousands of militiamen had poured in from across New England. They came from Massachusetts, from Connecticut, from Rhode Island, from New Hampshire, farm boys who dropped their plows in the field, apprentices who walked out of their workshops, gray-haired men who dug their muskets out of storage, weapons they had not fired since the French and Indian War 20 years earlier. They set up camps in Cambridge and Roxbury, along every single road leading out of the city. So the most powerful military on Earth held the town, but it could not leave it. Every time a patrol stepped beyond the city limits, colonial marksmen picked them off from behind stone walls and orchard fences. It was a bizarre standoff. A professional empire, trapped inside a port city by a loose collection of angry farmers who had no uniforms, no formal chain of command, and barely enough gunpowder to fill their cartridge boxes. Then, in late May, everything shifted. 3 ships arrived carrying reinforcements. And 3 of the most experienced generals in the British Army, men sent across the Atlantic to end this embarrassing little rebellion once and for all. They brought fresh troops, fresh confidence, and a plan. The plan was simple and it was sound. Break the siege by seizing the high ground. Take the hills on the Charlestown Peninsula to the north and Dorchester Heights to the south. Plant cannons up there and rain fire down onto the colonial camps until the militias scattered. Whoever controlled the hills controlled Boston. But intelligence in 1775 leaked like a cracked bucket, and word traveled fast. When the colonial leadership learned what the British intended, they made a daring decision. They would get there first. On the evening of June 16th, a colonial colonel gathered roughly 100 militiamen and marched them out under the cover of darkness. Their orders were to fortify the tallest point on the peninsula, but when they arrived, their commander and his engineers made a choice that would change everything. Instead of digging in on the safer, taller hill, they moved farther down to a smaller rise much closer to the harbor, well within range of the British warships. It seemed like a small decision in the dark. It was not small at all. It practically guaranteed the British would have no choice but to attack. And so, through the entire night, 200 men dug. They shoveled dirt, they stacked wooden frames, they raised a fort with walls, roughly 6 feet high, all of it by feel in the blackness. No campfires, no lanterns, orders passed in whispers. The engineers moved between the work crews, checking the angle and thickness of the walls with their bare hands. The night was warm and still, with just enough breeze off the water to mask the sound of the digging. The only real scare came when a loose shovel rang against a rock, and every man froze, staring out at the dark shapes of the warships riding at anchor in the moonlight. Nothing happened, and somehow, impossibly, the entire British fleet, sitting less than a mile away, never heard a thing. At first light on June 17th, a sailor aboard one of the British warships spotted the new fort through the morning haze, and within minutes the ship opened fire. The boom of naval cannons rolled across the harbor as iron shots screamed toward the Colonial earthworks. Other warships joined in, one after another. From the water it looked devastating, great columns of dirt and smoke rising off the hilltop with every impact. But here is the thing the British did not account for. Those naval guns were firing uphill at a steep angle, and they simply could not reach down inside the fort. Most of the shots sailed harmlessly over the walls or buried themselves in the packed earth. So the colonists crouched low, and they kept right on digging. And the British problems were only beginning, because what happened next is a detail most tellings leave out entirely. The plan called for British field artillery to soften up the fort before the infantry advanced. It was the smart, professional way to do it. But when the gun crews opened their ammunition, they discovered a mistake that would be almost comical if the day were not about to turn so bloody. The 6-pound cannons had been supplied with 12-pound cannonballs. The shot was simply too big to fit down the barrels. An army that prided itself on precision and discipline had sent the wrong ammunition to the front, and in that moment their artillery was nearly useless. Remember that, because it tells you something about the overconfidence that hung over this entire operation. Now, while the British were sorting out their guns, colonial marksmen had slipped into the abandoned houses of the little town of Charlestown. Down at the base of the hill, and from those windows and rooftops they began picking off British soldiers as they formed up. The British commander would not tolerate it. He gave an order to the Navy to turn its guns on the town itself. Cannonballs and heated incendiary shot rained down from the warships and from a battery on the high ground across the water, and Charlestown began to burn. And I want you to sit with this for a moment, because it is one of the great forgotten tragedies of that day. Charlestown was not an empty battlefield. It was a real town, almost 150 years old, home to somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, sailors, free families and enslaved families, all of them with lives and homes and histories on that peninsula. By the next morning, almost nothing was left standing. One witness called it a scene of ruin without parallel in all of America. Hold on to that image of the burning town, because we are going to come back to the people who lost everything that day. Back in Boston, the generals gathered for a war council, and this is where the battle could have gone very differently. One of the most experienced generals argued for the smart move, a flanking attack. Land troops behind the colonists cut off the narrow neck of land that was their only way back to the mainland and trapped them completely. With the peninsula nearly surrounded by water, that single move could have forced a surrender without a bloody frontal assault. But the commanding general disagreed. He wanted to march straight up the hill, meet the colonists head-on, and crush them with disciplined bayonet charges. His reasoning was not just tactical, it was psychological. He believed that if the British smashed through a fortified rebel position in a direct assault, It would break the spirit of the entire rebellion overnight. The other general pushed back hard, but he was overruled. And looking back, that decision was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, longboats began ferrying soldiers across the harbor, wave after wave of them assembling on the shore. Each man carried a full field pack, roughly 60 pounds of equipment, ammunition, rations, and a musket with a fixed bayonet. They were about to march uphill through tall grass in heavy wool uniforms under a hot June sun, carrying the weight of a small child on their backs. And up on the hill, watching them come, the Colonial commander knew his men were outnumbered and low on powder. Some had only 15 rounds, so he gave the order that would echo for the next 250 years. "Hold your fire," he told them, "until you can see the whites of their eyes." Now, historians still argue over who first said those exact words and whether they were said quite that way at all. But the meaning behind them was deadly practical. With so little ammunition, not a single shot could be wasted. The first British assault began in the early afternoon heat. The infantry came forward in long, disciplined lines, exactly the way they had trained for years on the parade grounds back in England, bayonets fixed, drums keeping time. But the ground fought them every step of the way. Their boots sank into the soft, uneven earth. Sweat soaked through those heavy wool coats, and many of them were already gasping for breath before they reached the halfway point. From behind the walls, the colonists watched them close the distance. 300 yards, 200, 150. The British officers walked out in front of their men, swords drawn, the gold trim on their uniforms catching the afternoon sun, making them the most visible targets on that entire hillside. And then the Colonial line exploded. Hundreds of muskets fired almost as one, and the effect was instant and catastrophic. The officers dropped first because the colonists had been told to aim for the fancy uniforms, and they followed that order with terrible precision. Behind them, whole rows of soldiers fell. The neat parade ground formation dissolved into chaos, men stumbling over the fallen, slipping on the bloody grass, and within minutes that first wave staggered back down the hill, leaving dozens of bodies scattered across the slope. Now, in most armies of that era, a repulse that bloody would have ended the attack right there. The men would simply refuse to climb back into that killing ground. But these were professionals, and their commander reformed them and sent them up a second time. And the second assault went even worse than the first. This time, the British pushed hard against the left flank, near a rail fence, and this is where one of the Colonial commanders had done something brilliant. He had recognized that the flank was dangerously exposed along the riverbank, so he threw together a makeshift barrier and then planted a stake in the ground exactly 40 yards out. And he told his men not to pull a trigger until the British crossed that line. When they did, his position erupted. The fire was so concentrated that survivors later described British soldiers falling in rows, like wheat going down before a scythe. The second assault collapsed faster than the first. Pay close attention here because this is the part that explains everything that followed. By now, the British had already suffered several hundred casualties, and they had not reached the fort even once. And still, the commanding general ordered a third assault. But this time, he changed his tactics. He had his men drop those heavy 60-pound packs. He narrowed the attack into a tight column aimed straight at the fort, and he told them not to stop and fire on the way up, but to close the distance fast and take the position with the bayonet alone. And this time it was different because the colonists were running out of powder. Some men poured the last of their cartridges down the barrel with shaking hands. Others were already empty. So when the British reached the walls and came pouring over the top, the fighting turned into something savage and close and personal. Men fired their last rounds and then threw rocks. They swung their muskets like clubs. They grabbed fence rails and used them as spears. British soldiers who survived it said it was the most vicious fighting they had ever known, worse than anything they had faced in Europe. And it was inside that smoke and chaos that the Colonial cause lost one of its brightest stars. There was a doctor in that fort, one of the most important political leaders in all of Massachusetts. He was the man who had helped organize the resistance, the man who had sent the famous Midnight Rider out to warn the countryside. He had just been made a major general, but he refused to command from the rear. He picked up a musket and fought as an ordinary volunteer, shoulder to shoulder with the farmers. and as the British swarmed over the wall, he was struck in the head and killed instantly. He became one of the first great martyrs of the Revolution, and his death would be mourned for generations. But there were other heroes on that hill whose names history almost forgot, and they deserve to be remembered right alongside him. Among the colonial defenders were dozens of black soldiers, some free, some born into slavery and fighting for a liberty they themselves had been denied. One of them had purchased his own freedom years earlier for the price of a full year's wages, and he fought that day with such extraordinary courage that 14 officers later signed a formal petition asking that he be honored. No other soldier on that entire field received that distinction, and here is the moment that still gives me chills. The British Marine officer leading that final charge up the hill, an officer many believed, had given the order that fired the very first shots of the war back at Lexington, was cut down at the top of the fort, and the man, widely credited with firing that fatal shot, was a black soldier. The man who many said had started the war was brought down by one of the very people his world refused to set free. In the end, with the powder gone, the colonial commander ordered a retreat. His men fell back across the peninsula, over the hills, and across the narrow neck to the mainland, and the British were too exhausted and too bloodied to chase them far. By late afternoon, the British held the hill. They had won. But the cost of that victory was staggering. Of the roughly 2,200 soldiers who made that assault, more than 1,000 were dead or wounded. It was the highest casualty count the British would suffer in any single battle of the entire war. Around 100 of their officers were among the fallen. Some regiments lost more than half their men. The colonists, by comparison, lost around 450. And one British general, who had begged for the flanking attack from the very start, wrote that night that it was a victory bought at far too dear a price. One more like it, he said, and they would have no army left in America. And that, right there, is the real legacy of this battle. The British won the field. They captured the fort, they held the peninsula, and on paper it was a clear tactical success. But something broke inside the British command that day, and it never fully healed. Before that hill, they believed they were fighting a disorganized mob of farmers who would scatter at the first real volley. After that hill, they knew the truth. They were fighting men who would stand behind a dirt wall, hold their fire until the last possible second, aim for the officers, and keep fighting with rocks and musket stocks after the powder ran out. The myth of red-coated invincibility died on that slope, and the commanding general carried the weight of it for the rest of the war. At battle after battle in the years that followed, when he had the colonial army cornered and could have crushed it, he hesitated, he pulled back, he let them slip away. He had seen what it cost to march into prepared positions, and he never wanted to hear those sounds again. The damage went far beyond one shaken general. That single afternoon convinced the British that they needed to hire thousands of foreign soldiers to have any hope of winning, because their own losses could not be replaced fast enough, and it hardened the politics on both sides. Within weeks, a final hopeful appeal for peace was sent across the ocean to the king, and the king rejected it outright and declared his colonies in open rebellion. The door to reconciliation slammed shut. And then there was the simple, brutal math that the British could never solve. Every soldier they lost had to be replaced by a man shipped across 3,000 miles of ocean, a voyage of 6 to 8 weeks. Every colonist who fell had 10 more ready to take his place. Men fighting on their own land, eating their own food, sleeping in their own barns. That math was never going to get better with time. Now remember that burning town I asked you to hold on to. Here is how that story ends. More than 450 families lost everything they owned that day, and afterward they filed claim after claim asking to be repaid for their homes and their livelihoods. They kept filing those claims for more than 50 years. They were never repaid. That was the quiet, uncounted price of liberty paid by ordinary people whose names rarely make it into the history books. And remember those black soldiers who fought so bravely on that hill. Their courage is a reminder that the freedom won that day was paid for in the blood of all kinds of men, including many who were still waiting for that freedom to be extended to them. There is one last detail I have to share because it is the kind of irony history loves. This entire battle, the one we have been talking about, is named after the wrong hill. The famous fighting, the 3 assaults, the order about the whites of their eyes, all of it happened on the lower hill, not the taller one the battle is named for. The name simply stuck, and history is messy like that. Today, a granite monument, 221 feet tall and finished in 1843, stands on that lower hill where the real fighting took place. It marks the spot where farmers and shopkeepers taught the most powerful army on earth a lesson it could not afford to learn twice. Because in the end, a victory without purpose is just a loss wearing a different uniform. So let me leave you with a question. Of everything you heard today, what surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. And if this story moved you, subscribe and stay with me, because there are so many more forgotten stories like this one waiting to be told.